The air off Samar is thick with salt and humidity. You're on the deck of a tiny destroyer escort, a ship they call a tin can. Your job is to protect the slow carriers hunting submarines. But a lookout screams, pointing at the horizon. Pagoda masts, dozens of them. The unmistakable silhouettes of the most powerful battleships on Earth. A giant has stumbled into your backyard, and your captain, instead of running, gives the most insane order you've ever heard. Turn towards the enemy and attack. This was the reality for the sailors of Task Unit 77.4.3 on the morning of October 25th, 1944. The first reports were met with disbelief. On the bridge of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's flagship, the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, officers assumed the pilot must be seeing the friendly battleships of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. But the follow-up reports were chillingly specific. The towering superstructures, the unique pagoda-style masts, belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. This was no friendly force. This was the hammer of Japan, and it was falling directly on them. To grasp the sheer impossibility of this moment, one must understand the grand strategic chessboard of the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, was underway. General Douglas MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines was in full swing, with hundreds of thousands of American soldiers ashore. Their entire existence depended on a fragile supply line guarded by the U.S. Navy. The primary shield for this invasion was Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet, a terrifying concentration of naval power with fast aircraft carriers and modern battleships. But Halsey was gone. The Japanese, in a desperate, complex gamble called Operation Shogo, had sent a decoy fleet of carriers with almost no aircraft south from their home waters. The bait was irresistible. Halsey, a carrier man to his core, gathered his entire fleet and raced north to destroy it, believing he was striking at the heart of Japan's naval air power. He had left a critical gateway, the San Bernardino Strait, completely unguarded. Through that unguarded gate, in the dead of night, slipped Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and the Japanese Center Force. This was no mere raiding party. It was the steel fist of the Imperial Navy. It was led by the super-battleship Yamato, a monster of 72,000 tons, the heaviest and most powerfully armed warship ever to sail. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, each capable of launching an armor-piercing shell weighing over 3,000 pounds across a distance of nearly 26 miles. Accompanying her were 3 more battleships, including the veteran Nagato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a screen of 11 destroyers. This was a force built to annihilate entire battle fleets, a force that had slipped through the American defenses and was now bearing down on the soft, unprotected underbelly of the Leyte invasion. The only thing in its path was Taffy 3. The name itself sounded small and unassuming, and it was. Commanded by Admiral Sprague, it was a task unit of 6 escort carriers. Slow, small carriers built on merchant ship hulls, so flimsy their crews joked they were made of cardboard and kindling. These jeep carriers could barely make 18 knots, far too slow to outrun the swift Japanese cruisers. Protecting these floating airfields were just 3 Fletcher-class destroyers and 4 even smaller, slower destroyer escorts. These were the tin cans, vessels with thin armor but packed with courage. Their designated role was anti-submarine warfare and providing close air support for the troops on the ground. They were never, under any circumstances, meant to engage in a surface battle with the titans of the Imperial Japanese Navy. As the first shells began to fall, their splashes erupting in the colossal, brightly dyed geysers of water, Sprague knew his situation was not just desperate, it was impossible. His ships were outranged, outgunned, and outrun. The fate of the entire Philippine invasion now rested on the shoulders of the most mismatched naval force in modern history. On the bridge of the USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague faced a decision that would defy every page of naval doctrine. Retreat was impossible. His slow-motion carriers would be picked off one by the faster Japanese cruisers. Surrender was unthinkable. That left only one option, an option so suicidal it bordered on madness: attack. He gave the order to turn his carriers into the wind, not to flee, but to launch every available aircraft, no matter how ill-equipped. Pilots scrambled to their FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. Many of these planes were armed not for naval warfare, but for ground support, carrying small anti-personnel bombs and depth charges. It didn't matter. They were ordered to take off and attack the Japanese fleet with anything they had. Simultaneously, Sprague gave the order that would define the battle: small boys, attack. He was ordering his tiny screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts to charge directly into the guns of the most powerful surface fleet on the planet. For one commander, that order was unnecessary. On the bridge of the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans had already seen the enemy. A man of Cherokee and Creek heritage, known for his ferocity and unwavering resolve, Evans had told his crew on the day he took command that he would never run from a fight, and that anyone who didn't want to go in harm's way had better get off now. No one did. Without waiting for instructions from Sprague, Evans gave his own legendary command: all ahead flank. Commence firing. The Johnston heeled over, its engines screaming as it surged forward, laying a thick curtain of black smoke to shield the retreating carriers. It was the first American ship to turn towards the enemy, the first to open fire, and for a terrifying few minutes, it was completely alone. The Johnston was a David charging a fleet of Goliaths. Imagine the scene from the Japanese perspective. An admiral like Kurita, commanding the pride of the Imperial Navy, expects a certain logic to naval combat. He expects his smaller, outgunned opponents to flee. Instead, this single, insignificant American destroyer was racing towards him, its 5-inch guns barking defiantly. These were weapons that couldn't hope to penetrate the armor of his battleships, yet they fired relentlessly. The Johnston's charge was not about sinking battleships with gunfire. It was about closing the distance. The true sting of a destroyer was its torpedoes. To use them, Evans had to sail his ship through a storm of steel, navigating the geysers of near misses from shells larger than a man. Each salvo from the Japanese heavy cruisers sent walls of water into the air, drenching the decks and rattling the ship to its core. The audacity of the attack had an immediate, disorienting effect. The other destroyers, the USS Hole and USS Heermann, along with the smaller destroyer escorts like the USS Samuel B. Roberts, saw the Johnston's charge and followed suit. A scattered line of tin cans plunged headlong into the enemy formation. Their primary tactic was to sow chaos. By charging from different directions and using their smoke generators to obscure the battlefield, they aimed to disrupt the Japanese gunnery control, break up their formations, and force the massive ships to maneuver wildly to avoid torpedo attacks. This prevented the Japanese from forming a coherent battle line and bringing their overwhelming firepower to bear on the slow, vulnerable carriers. It was the naval equivalent of a pack of wolves harassing a massive bear, biting at its heels, forcing it to turn and swipe, distracting it from its true prey. But these wolves were made of thin steel, and the bear's claws were 18-inch naval rifles. The charge was on, a desperate gamble against impossible odds, and for the men on those destroyers, every second felt like a lifetime. As the USS Johnston closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, Commander Evans gave the order to fire torpedoes. A spread of 10 deadly fish leaped into the water, racing towards the enemy. For the crew, it was an agonizing wait. Then a brilliant flash, and a plume of black smoke erupted from the Kumano. One torpedo had struck home, blowing the bow completely off the cruiser and forcing it out of the fight. The tiny Johnston had drawn first blood, crippling a warship that massively outclassed it. But the victory came at a terrible price. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo, followed by a salvo of 6-inch shells from a light cruiser, slammed into the little destroyer. The devastation was instantaneous. The bridge was shattered. Evans himself was grievously wounded, losing 2 fingers and suffering shrapnel wounds across his face and shoulder. Communications were wiped out. The ship lost all power to its aft engine room and its rear gun turrets. In the span of 30 seconds, the charging hunter had become a crippled wreck. Yet the fight was far from over. Driven by sheer will, the crew of the Johnston performed miracles. Steering control was lost on the bridge, so Evans, shouting through an open hatch to the men in the aft steering room, commanded the ship manually by its rudders. Power was jury-rigged, and the forward guns, still miraculously intact, continued to fire. The Johnston was bleeding, battered, but still defiant. As it limped away from its initial attack, it stumbled upon a line of Japanese destroyers, launching a torpedo attack on the American carriers. Without hesitation, Evans ordered his ship to engage. Firing over 1,000 rounds from its remaining guns, the Johnston drove off the Japanese destroyers, disrupting their torpedo run and saving the carriers from certain doom. The crippled American ship was acting as a bulldog, refusing to let go, its crew fighting with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. Meanwhile, the other small boys were pressing their own desperate attacks. The USS Hole and USS Heermann charged in, firing torpedoes and absorbing a horrific amount of punishment. Following them was a ship even smaller and more outgunned, the USS Samuel B. Roberts. A destroyer escort, the Roberts was affectionately known as a DE, but her crew had a different interpretation. They called themselves DE-stroyers, and on this day they would earn that name. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, the Samuel B. Roberts was only rated for a top speed of 24 knots, but her engineers pushed the boilers to their absolute limits, coaxing an astonishing 28 knots out of the straining vessel. Copeland announced to his crew over the ship's intercom, "This will be a fighting run. It will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." As the Roberts charged, it began a duel with a Japanese heavy cruiser, its 2 5-inch guns spitting shells at a target they could barely scratch. The sailors knew their armor-piercing rounds would likely bounce off the cruiser's thick belt armor, so they switched to high-explosive shells, aiming not to sink the behemoth, but to blind it. They targeted the bridge, the rangefinders, and the gun directors, hoping to pepper the superstructure, wound the crew, and disrupt its ability to fight. It was a tactic of pure desperation, the naval equivalent of throwing rocks at a tank. And all the while, the pilots from Taffy 3's carriers swarmed the Japanese fleet. With no armor-piercing bombs, They made repeated strafing runs on the bridges of the battleships and cruisers, a terrifying experience for the Japanese officers, who were unaccustomed to such close-quarters air attacks. The sky and sea had become a maelstrom of smoke, explosions, and raw, unfiltered courage. The American pilots overhead were fighting their own battle of desperation. Having expended their bombs and torpedoes on their first frantic runs, they returned to their carriers only to find them under intense naval gunfire. Landings were next to impossible, so they flew back towards the Japanese fleet, their machine guns empty, their bomb bays bare. What followed was one of the most remarkable instances of psychological warfare in the conflict. Pilots made dry runs, diving on the Japanese warships as if they were about to launch torpedoes. For the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, there was no way to know which planes were a threat and which were a bluff. Every diving Avenger had to be treated as a deadly enemy. This forced the Japanese ships to continue their violent, evasive maneuvers, breaking formation and spoiling their gunners' aim. Pilots reported seeing Japanese captains so rattled they were firing at phantom torpedo wakes. This relentless harassment, even when symbolic, contributed immensely to the growing chaos within Kurita's fleet. This confusion was amplified by the very nature of the American force. Admiral Kurita and his staff were convinced they were engaging elements of Halsey's main fleet. They misidentified the small, boxy escort carriers as full-sized fleet carriers. The sheer ferocity of the American response seemed to confirm this. Small, lightly armed screening vessels simply did not attack battleships. Therefore, the ships attacking them must be the powerful cruisers of a main battle group. The smoke screens, the intermittent rain squalls that swept across the battlefield, and the constant buzzing air attacks created a fog of war so thick that the Japanese tactical picture completely disintegrated. They were fighting a ghost, an enemy that behaved with an illogical aggression that defied all their training and expectations. They were landing devastating blows, but their opponent refused to act beaten. Down on the water, the USS Samuel B. Roberts continued its legendary fight. Closing to within a perilous 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser, Chokai, Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered his torpedoes launched. The crew watched as the wakes raced toward the enemy ship. A massive explosion erupted from the Chokai's stern, crippling her steering and slowing her to a crawl. The little destroyer escort, a ship half the speed and 1/10 the firepower of its opponent, had landed a fatal blow on a premier Japanese heavy cruiser. But like the Johnston, the Roberts paid the price for its audacity. The Japanese fleet now concentrated its fire on the tiny vessel. It was hit by shell after shell, tearing massive holes in its thin hull. One hit disabled the forward gun. In that turret, gunner's mate, 3rd Class Paul H. Carr, despite being mortally wounded with his body torn open, managed to single-handedly load and fire one last round before collapsing. His actions were a microcosm of the spirit aboard that ship, a refusal to quit even in the face of certain death. The battle had devolved into a series of brutal one-on-one duels. The USS Gambier Bay, one of Sprague's escort carriers, found itself singled out by the Japanese cruisers. Unable to escape, it was pounded relentlessly by accurate, methodical gunfire. Shells tore through its unarmored flight deck and hangar, turning the ship into an inferno. It became the only U.S. aircraft carrier in history to be sunk exclusively by naval gunfire. The USS Hull was also fighting for its life, absorbing over 40 hits before its engines finally died. Listing heavily, with most of its guns silenced, its crew prepared to abandon ship, The cost of Taffy 3's defiance was becoming horrifically clear. The tin cans had charged into the fire, and now they were burning. But they had bought the most precious commodity on any battlefield: time. By now, the Japanese center force was in a state of tactical disarray. Admiral Kurita's battle plan had completely unraveled. Instead of a coordinated fleet action, his ships were scattered across miles of ocean, hunting individual American vessels. His flagship, the Yamato, had been forced to turn away to avoid a torpedo spread from the USS Herman, taking it temporarily out of the main fight. Communication breakdowns were rampant. Kurita was receiving conflicting reports from his commanders, who were themselves struggling to identify targets in the smoke and rain. The ferocity of the American destroyer attacks had forced his cruisers to the front to fend them off, disrupting his intended battle formation and leaving his battleships without a proper screen. He was winning by any conventional measure, but he had lost control of the battle. The psychological toll on Kurita cannot be overstated. He was an exhausted man commanding an exhausted fleet. His force had already endured a harrowing journey to reach this point, surviving American submarine attacks in the Palawan Passage that had sunk 2 of his heavy cruisers, and withstanding intense air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea. His own flagship had been sunk from under him, forcing him to transfer to the Yamato. He had been led to believe the American Third Fleet was neutralized, yet he was now facing what appeared to be a major carrier task force fighting with suicidal determination. The constant air attacks, the relentless destroyer charges, and the inability to form a coherent picture of the enemy's strength and disposition wore him down. Every piece of information he received seemed to contradict the last. He was fighting blind in a hurricane of American defiance. Meanwhile, the sacrifice of the small boys was reaching its zenith. The USS Hull finally succumbed to its wounds and slipped beneath the waves. The crippled USS Samuel B. Roberts, its back broken by a massive salvo, began to founder. Its crew, having inflicted damage far beyond what their ship was ever designed for, was ordered to abandon ship, but the spirit of defiance continued. On the shattered wreck of the USS Johnston, Commander Evans, despite his horrific injuries, was spotted by survivors as the ship went down. He was seen on the fantail, shouting orders to his men, ensuring they got off the sinking vessel. He would go down with his ship, a final act of devotion to his crew. He had fulfilled his promise. He had not run from a fight. The loss of these ships was a terrible blow, but their final acts had achieved their purpose. They had drawn the fire of the Japanese fleet, absorbing the punishment that would have otherwise been directed at the escort carriers. They had shattered the cohesion of Kurita's force, turning his powerful fleet into a confused gaggle of individual ships. And crucially, they had made the Japanese bleed. In addition to the crippled Kumano, the heavy cruiser Chokai, savaged by the Samuel B. Roberts and carrier aircraft, was now a drifting wreck. The cruiser Chikuma, also battered by torpedoes and bombs, was burning fiercely. The supposedly invincible Japanese fleet was being taken apart, piece by piece, by an enemy it was supposed to sweep aside with ease. The American strategy of trading tin cans for time was working, but no one knew if it would be enough. The remaining carriers were still exposed, and the Japanese battleships were still out there, their massive guns searching for targets. Just as the situation for Taffy 3 seemed utterly hopeless, the tide began to turn in the most unexpected way. Aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Kurita was staring at the brink of a historic victory. The American escort carriers were in sight, their destruction seemingly inevitable. Annihilating them and proceeding to the Leyte Gulf landing beaches was the entire purpose of his mission. Yet at precisely 9:11 in the morning, after just over 2 hours of brutal combat, he made one of the most controversial decisions in naval history. He ordered his fleet to disengage and turn north. The command, "All ships, my course north, speed 20, spread through the Japanese fleet, causing confusion and disbelief among his own captains. They were winning. The ultimate prize was within their grasp. Why were they turning back? Kurita's decision was not born from a single factor, but from the culmination of everything he had endured. He was operating in an information vacuum. He still believed he was fighting a powerful element of Halsey's Third Fleet, and that the ships he had just engaged were only the screening force. He reasoned that by turning north, he could consolidate his scattered fleet and prepare for the main engagement he was sure was coming. His fleet had also taken more damage than he initially realized. 3 of his heavy cruisers were sunk or sinking, and his own flagship, the mighty Yamato, had been forced to turn away from the battle. His destroyers were low on fuel and had expended many of their precious torpedoes. The relentless, albeit small-scale air attacks had convinced him that he was under threat from a much larger air group than the 6 small carriers of Taffy 3 could possibly muster. The American deception, born of desperation, had worked perfectly. The fake torpedo runs by unarmed planes, the aggressive charges of the destroyers, and the sheer, bloody-minded refusal of the American force to break had painted a picture of immense strength and resolve. Kurita, a cautious and methodical commander, interpreted this suicidal bravery not as desperation, but as the confidence of a superior force luring him into a larger trap. He feared that the rest of Halsey's fleet was about to fall on his disorganized ships from the north, and his priority shifted from destroying Taffy 3 to preserving his own fleet to fight another day. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, a psychological victory for the Americans that was as decisive as any torpedo hit. For the surviving sailors and airmen of Taffy 3, the sight of the Japanese fleet turning away was nothing short of a miracle. They watched, stunned, as the pagoda mast that had loomed so menacingly on the horizon began to shrink, their guns falling silent. They had held the line. They had faced the executioner and, through sheer audacity, had convinced him to put away his sword. Rear Admiral Sprague, his voice thick with emotion, broadcast a simple message to his battered task unit. "The enemy is retiring to the northward." He couldn't believe it himself. He had fully expected to lose every one of his ships. But the battle was not quite over. Even as the Japanese surface ships retreated, a new and even more terrifying threat was appearing in the sky. The first organized kamikaze attacks of the war were about to descend upon the survivors of Taffy 3, a final, cruel postscript to their ordeal. The escort carrier USS St. Lo, which had survived the naval battle, was struck by a Zero fighter deliberately crashed into its flight deck, triggering massive internal explosions and sending it to the bottom. It was a bitter end to a morning of impossible survival. The aftermath of the battle off Samar was a scene of stark contrast. On the American side, there was a grim accounting of the cost. 2 destroyers, the Whole and the Johnston, were gone. The destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, had fought its last fight. 2 escort carriers, the Gambier Bay and the St. Lo, lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Over 1,000 American sailors and airmen were killed, wounded, or missing, many cast adrift in shark-infested waters, waiting for a rescue that would be tragically delayed. Taffy 3 had been savaged. pushed to the very brink of annihilation. But in the cold calculus of war, they had achieved a victory of staggering strategic importance. They had stopped Kurita's center force dead in its tracks. The Leyte invasion beaches were safe. The artery supplying MacArthur's army remained uncut. A handful of tin cans and jeep carriers had saved the entire Philippine campaign. Across the horizon, the retreating Japanese fleet was also counting its losses. 3 heavy cruisers, the Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, were sunk. The cruiser Kumano was so heavily damaged it would never see combat again. More importantly, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a fatal blow to its morale and its strategic capability. Operation Shogo, the grand, complex plan to crush the American invasion, had failed at its climactic moment. The failure was so profound, so inexplicable, that it would be debated for decades. Why did the most powerful battleship force on Earth turn away from a handful of escort carriers? The answer lay not in firepower, but in the human element. Kurita's decision was a testament to the power of chaos, deception, and the sheer unpredictable force of human courage in the face of impossible odds. The legacy of the battle was cemented in the stories of the men who fought it. Commander Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, a recognition of his incredible bravery in leading the initial charge. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, would receive the Navy Cross. The entire task unit, Taffy 3, was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, an honor usually reserved for individual ships in recognition of their collective heroism. The engagement became a textbook example within the U.S. Navy of how a smaller, determined force could use aggressive tactics and calculated sacrifice to defeat a larger, more powerful adversary. It was a brutal lesson in asymmetric warfare, fought not with guided missiles and smart bombs, but with steel, guts, and an unbreakable will to fight. The battle off Samar would forever be known as the last stand of the tin can sailors. It was a battle that should never have been fought, a mismatch of epic proportions that violated every rule of naval engagement. It was not a battle of grand strategies executed by admirals moving fleets on a map. It was a brawl, a desperate close-quarters slugfest, where the primary weapons were not 18-inch guns, but the courage of individual sailors. It was the story of pilots making pretend attack runs in unarmed planes, of gunners firing their last shells while mortally wounded, and of captains who chose to charge towards certain death rather than abandon the ships they were sworn to protect. It was a moment in history where the intangible qualities of the human spirit proved more powerful than the thickest armor plate, a final defiant roar from the age of naval gunnery. Analyzing the tactical decisions reveals the core of Taffy 3's success, the deliberate creation of chaos. Admiral Sprague and his commanders understood they could not win a conventional, orderly naval duel. A straight-up gunnery exchange would have resulted in their swift and total destruction. Their only hope was to turn the battle into a knife fight in the dark. The aggressive destroyer charges were the first element of this strategy. By plunging directly into the heart of the Japanese formation, they forced Kurita's ships to break their battle line. A battleship's primary advantage is its ability to bring a massive, coordinated broadside to bear on a target. By forcing these giants to swerve and maneuver to avoid torpedoes, the small boys prevented them from ever achieving this. The Japanese gunners, some of the best in the world, were constantly having their firing solutions disrupted, their targets obscured by smoke, and their ships shaken by evasive turns. The use of smoke was the second pillar of this chaos strategy. The destroyers and even the aircraft laid thick, persistent smoke screens between the Japanese fleet and the vulnerable American carriers. This simple, ancient tactic proved devastatingly effective. It blinded the superb Japanese rangefinders and optics, forcing them to rely on less accurate radar or to fire intermittently at fleeting glimpses of their targets. For a fleet that prided itself on precision gunnery at long range, this was infuriating. It reduced the world's most powerful battleships to firing at shadows, their massive shells splashing harmlessly into the ocean as the American carriers slipped in and out of the protective gloom. Sprague skillfully used the intermittent rain squalls that passed over the area as mobile extensions of his smoke screens, ordering his ships to change course to take advantage of the temporary concealment. The third, and perhaps most crucial element, was the relentless and coordinated air attacks. While the damage they inflicted with their small bombs and depth charges was often superficial, the psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese doctrine viewed surface combat and air combat as separate phases of a battle. They were not prepared for a simultaneous, integrated assault from the sea and the sky. The constant strafing runs on their bridges, while causing minimal physical damage to the ship, had a profound effect on the command and control centers. Officers were forced to take cover, communications were disrupted, and the simple act of observing the battle became a life-threatening endeavor. This multi-axis assault from the destroyers on the surface and the aircraft from above overwhelmed the Japanese tactical processing, contributing to the confusion that ultimately led Kurita to misinterpret the entire situation. This symphony of chaos stands in stark contrast to the rigid, hierarchical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Kurita expected the battle to unfold according to a predictable script, one where his superior range and firepower would methodically dismantle the American force from a distance. When the Americans refused to follow this script, when they charged instead of running, and when they fought with a ferocity that seemed to ignore their own survival, the Japanese plan fell apart. The American commanders, particularly men like Evans and Copeland, demonstrated a remarkable degree of initiative and adaptability. They didn't wait for orders, they saw what needed to be done and did it. This decentralized command, where individual ship captains were empowered to make bold, independent decisions, was perfectly suited to the chaotic environment they had created. It was the flexibility of the American approach versus the rigidity of the Japanese that ultimately decided the outcome, long before Kurita gave the final order to retreat. In the grand narrative of the Second World War, the Battle off Samar is often overshadowed by the larger carrier clashes like Midway or the brutal island campaigns of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Yet its significance is profound. It represents a pivotal moment where the war in the Pacific truly turned a corner, not just strategically, but philosophically. For years, the Japanese battleship, epitomized by the colossal Yamato, had been a symbol of immense, almost mythical power. It was the ultimate expression of naval might, a floating embodiment of the Bushido spirit. On October 25, 1944, that myth was shattered. The Yamato and its powerful consorts were turned back, not by their American counterparts, not by an equal force of arms, but by a handful of the smallest, most disposable ships in the U.S. Navy. The age of the battleship as the undisputed queen of the seas, an era that began with the dreadnoughts of the early 20th century, effectively ended in the waters off Samar. The battle also served as a grim foreshadowing of the war's final, brutal chapter. The introduction of the kamikaze against the survivors of Taffy 3 was the birth of a terrifying new tactic. It signaled Japan's shift towards a strategy of desperation, where the human will was to be weaponized in its most literal and final form. The sinking of the St. Lo was the first of many such attacks that would plague the U.S. Navy all the way to Tokyo Bay. It showed that even as Japan's conventional military power was being systematically dismantled, its capacity to inflict pain and suffering through sheer fanaticism was only just beginning. The heroism of Taffy 3 had saved the day, but it had also offered a glimpse into the horrific nature of the fighting that was still to come. Ultimately, the story of Taffy 3 is more than just a battle analysis. It is a timeless epic of the underdog. It is a testament to the idea that the outcome of a conflict is not solely determined by the quality of the machines, but by the spirit of the people who operate them. The sailors on the Johnston, the Hole, and the Samuel B. Roberts knew they were sailing into oblivion. They were fully aware that their thin hulls offered no protection from the shells of a battleship, yet they turned towards the enemy anyway. They did so not because they expected to win, but because their duty demanded it. They fought to protect the carriers, which in turn were protecting the thousands of soldiers on the beaches of Leyte. It was a chain of sacrifice, a demonstration of courage so profound that it managed to warp the very fabric of naval reality, turning a certain defeat into one of history's most improbable victories. When we look back on this incredible engagement, we are reminded that history is not just a sequence of dates and strategic decisions. It is forged in moments of intense human drama, on the smoke-filled bridges and in the fiery engine rooms of ships whose names should never be forgotten. The battle off Samar was not won by admirals on a plotting table hundreds of miles away. It was won by the grit of ordinary men who were asked to do the impossible, and who responded by doing more. They held the line. They were the tin can sailors, and their last stand remains one of the finest hours in the history of the United States Navy, a legacy of courage that will echo for as long as tales of the sea are told.